This episode is sponsored by Artlist.io.
Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to Wait, do I have to redo that?
Yeah, that was horrible.
Hey, what up? Today we're talking about sound. It's what you hear with your ears that you can put in your edit. Is that good?
And cut.
Hey, what's up, guys? Christian here for Kriscoart. Welcome to episode 5 of our editing workshop. Today we're talking about sound design. I like the other one better. So today we're going to do things a little bit differently. We're actually going to look at 5 theory tips, some 5 practical tips that you can do inside of Premiere as far as sound design. And then we're going to have a chat with Alex from 344 Audio, and his body of work is incredible, and he's into sharing his thought process and his knowledge on how he does things with sound with you guys. And I actually had a really interesting Skype conversation with him, which I'll show a little bit of in this episode. So let's start with 5 ideas that you should keep in mind whenever you're going into creating your sound design for your piece. So the first thing that you should think about going into your scene is, what kind of scene is it? What are we seeing in that scene, and where is this taking place? So for example, right now I'm sitting in my living room. We could have some sounds from outside, maybe some trees rustling, some birds, some ambience from the exterior, and then inside here we could have some room tone. We could have the creaking of the stool that I'm sitting on and my voice. So these are all kind of elements that we're seeing and that we can add into our timeline. But aside from that, you need to really think about what kind of scene are you trying to tell? What's the tone? What's the emotion that you're trying to convey through your sound? And based on that, you can actually select what kind of sounds that you're going to be introducing into your timeline. And Alex is going to show this much deeper with the example that I mentioned in the beginning. But these are some of the things that you should think about, and something that helps when it comes to deciding what elements you're introducing into your scene is thinking of your scene in terms of layers. So you can start from the background and the overall ambience and just start building off of that, and then move closer to the middle ground and maybe even to the foreground, or whatever is closest to our source through which we're hearing the scene from. And that's another important point to keep in mind, is sometimes we're not listening to the world that you're creating in front of the camera through the camera. Sometimes we're listening through sounds through a subject, and that can become very subjective, and it could really alter, change, and even exaggerate the way that we hear things as an audience. A good example from this is the scene from Saving Private Ryan where they're landing on the beach, and the sound there is entirely subjective. So us as the audience, we're starting to feel the panic and the fear because we're listening to the sounds, we're absorbing this moment through the subject's perspective. And then from there, of course, the more sounds that you can play with that were captured on set, on location, the better, just because then you don't have to worry about processing the sounds as much, since they are already belonging to that scene that we're seeing and that you're shooting. So a good way of doing this is to do it yourself, or have someone just kind of mentally run through the scenes that you shot and try to capture as many elements of Foley or any kind of other sounds that you can while you're still on that location. If you have the luxury of time, you can look at playback and see what you're missing in terms of sound. For example, in this short film, since we're seeing him opening the car, going into the car, these are all elements that would be great to grab right then and there. You can even go there with a recorder, with your phone, just capture something that is true to that object that's being interacted with, especially when it comes to maybe an antique car or something that's very specific that might have its own character in terms of sound, not just in terms of engine, but even the door, how it opens, the leather seats, how they creak, and all these things. It could be just a lot better to grab that authentic sound from the source. But of course, you don't have to. It's just a plus if you do. You can always rely on sound libraries online. There's just a ton of them. There's even a ton of free sources that you can find. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a collection of sounds that I use most often, and I'll link them in the description down below so you guys can at least have a place to get started. So I want to jump into the Skype conversation that I had with Alex, because there's a lot of nice nuggets of information in there, and then we'll jump into the breakdown after that. What are some of the steps or some of the things that people should be thinking about? People that are not professionals, people that
don't do this as their career specifically with sound have that part and do it themselves? What would be some of the things that they should think about, and some of the steps that they should take to really make their sound design sound as best as it can?
One of the first things, and I think this is a common mistake, it's probably a common mistake in editing as well on a low budget, I'd assume, but obviously with sound you have a lot more tracks, so this becomes more of an issue. I think the first step would be actually organization in your session. So if you create a session that's not organized and you don't start from a session template, so even if you're doing that in a video editing software like Premiere Pro, I assume there's a way to like create a template, even if that's just a file that you open each time, like a raw file that's already got tracks laid out. And that way, when you're putting in your sound effects and your dialogue tracks and everything else and your music, you don't have to do this whole messy process of trying to find out where something's been placed and things like that. And that alone is going to, speed up your workflow, which means that you're going to be kind of getting less stressed about something. So say you're placing in a couple of sound effects. If you can locate those sound effects in your session every time by having a nice template, that means that you're going to be more encouraged to do creative stuff. And that's obviously what you want to be doing if you're trying to do your own sound design. You don't want to be worrying about, where did I put that sound effect? And is that the dialogue track or is that the music track? So the first step would be organizing your session. Step two would be to consider, in general terms, it's all about creating a soundscape that's full. So in order to do that, there's a lot of elements that come into it, and it's not just about matching what's on screen, it's about matching what's off screen as well. So as a beginner, the first thing you want to experiment with is layering sounds. So say, for example, you're creating the ambience in your film, like the background tracks. You want to lay in a couple of stereo sound effects of say you're outside, you want to have some wind, maybe some birds, maybe some kind of low rumbling wind. So you want to think about different kind of elements, like high elements, mid elements and low elements that kind of together combine and fill out that soundscape. And if you can create a soundscape that sounds full, that alone is going to elevate kind of the quality of your film, or the perceived quality, because it's similar to picture, where if you've got a very balanced color palette, your film looks nice and it's nice to look at. It's the same in sound. If you don't have a balanced palette of sound, your film's going to feel really cheap in the soundscape. The
goal with anything, with any kind of film, is that you're creating a world and you want your audience to be immersed in that world. So you need to really think of what that actually means, because I think our ears and our brain does a really good job at kind of tuning things out in our daily life. And there's a lot more sounds that are actually happening that we don't even realize. If I have an outdoor scene in a specific area, I'll go for a walk there, and instead of having a conversation with a friend or thinking about work or whatever else, I start to really pay attention to what am I hearing? And if you switch your brain in that sort of way, you start to realize that the world actually throws a lot more information at you that you might think. And like you said, it's not just what you're seeing, but it's everything around there, and thinking in terms of how that all sets, again, this world, this tone, and how that supports the story. And from what you're saying there about when the example you gave where you go out to the park and you kind of listen to sounds, a lot of what happens in sound design, or the way I approach sound design, comes from what is actually innate in humans and why we hear things the way we hear things. And that's how I kind of approach the way I'm working. We've developed as humans like the need where we don't need to use our ears in the same way that we would have when we were hunter-gatherers. So the fact that your brain's able to kind of zone out the world and focus on your friend is because we've developed in civilization to a point where we value social systems more than we value our hearing for survival purposes. And that's why your brain's able to completely ignore everything around you and just focus on that dialogue that's happening. So it's important to backtrack there when you're approaching your film sound and forget the way that your brain perceives sound, and think about how does it perceive it when you actually focus on it, because that's how an audience actually want to hear the sound. They don't want to hear it how it is in real life. They want to hear it how it is when you've not got any distractions and you just sat focusing and listening. Because remember that a film is hyper-realistic in every way. The way an actor acts is generally quite hyper-realistic. You wouldn't, tell an actor to act necessarily exactly how they would in real life most of the time. And it's the same with sound. You got to think of it as more of a creative thing, and you got to think about the world as a separate world to the world that we're in.
where there's less rules basically. You know, you're kind of in control of the physics of the way that the sound interacts. You know, to maybe, like you said, go out into a location and just don't have a distraction, don't look at your phone, don't look at anything, maybe even close your eyes and just listen.
Yeah.
And that's probably what your audience want to be hearing.
Yeah, and like you said, even with the hyperrealism of it all, it's going back to the example of an actor. Sometimes they might need to over exaggerate certain expressions, kind of like the theater way of doing it, because you really want to drive in some emotional cues to the audience that you want to make sure they don't want to miss. And that can be the same for sound. I mean, you can create something that feels real, and again, that, like you said, that isn't necessarily real, but that just feels real. And then you can add cues in there once you've had them invested in it, and then you again continue. How can this story speak through the sound, and then adding little bits here and there like that, which I think can be really powerful.
Yeah, it's kind of like you're saying, it's also a balance as well between some reality and some creativity and kind of hyperrealism. So you have to obviously get them hooked, like you said. But once you have them hooked and it's believable, then you can take it a step further. So say, for example, you know, you're in a particular location, you will still to some extent need the sound of that location in there. But that doesn't mean that you can't start to add other things that maybe weren't present on the day of shooting, but are present in the world that you're trying to create.
I think one of the challenging aspects of hearing maybe this way of thinking of it for the first time would be, okay, like how do I find that balance? Like how do I make, or even in terms of style, how do I make something stylistic that still fits the tone and mood of the story? How do I make it hyper real so I can maybe even guide the audience's ears in a certain way? And how do I keep it realistic so that it's still believable and I still keep that sort of suspension of disbelief in terms of sound? Like, how do I find that balance?
There's quite a few ways. So one of the most common techniques, something that I do quite a lot, is instead of just going into a sound library and selecting a sound, think about the type of that sound that you want. So what I mean by that is anybody can go into a sound library and drag a sound effect called Wind 01 into their session and kind of cover an exterior scene with a little bit of wind. But you have to think about what is that wind saying about the film and about the scene? Is that wind saying that it doesn't want to be noticed and it is just kind of suspending reality? Or does that wind want to be a creepier wind, like maybe a more whistly wind? Because there's I don't know, like a kind of a bad guy in the film about to approach the scene. Do we want to kind of create this mysterious vibe with a whistling wind? Or do we want a super heavy wind that's giving us the impression that, you know, there's a big kind of, I don't know, weather kind of situation going on outside? So that's an example of how you would take reality and then choose different options of what reality you kind of want to give to the audience. Another common example would be the sound of animals. That's one of the ones that I use quite a lot. So depending on obviously the location of the film, if it's based in America, you've got a lot more options than British people have because we've got very limited wildlife here. So we can't just throw in, you know, a wolf or a bear like you can. But, you know, even with birds are one of the most common ones. So, you know, a lot of films, you'll hear them go into a forest and all you hear is tweet, 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 and it's the same bird sounds. Some good sound designers would think, is there something I can say about this forest with the bird sounds? Do I want to be using owls? Is it a different time of day where there might be an owl? Do I want kind of, you know, a hawk to fly over? You know, there's all different things you can do with just animals in the background. Do I want to put in crows, which are usually associated with fear? Or negative connotations. So there's a lot of different, you know, options there, and all of those are possible, you know, in the realm of film and in the realm of reality. So that's what you've got to look at. What is possible in this world, and which possibility do I want to go with?
So to me, that was super interesting. There were just so much little gems in there. And since the conversation was quite long, I'm going to section it off into little chunks that I'll show in the live streams that are happening every Friday at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Okay, so now that we talked about all of that, let's actually see how we can get these ideas and use them in a practical sense inside of Premiere Pro.
So one of the questions that I get asked the most is where I get my music from, and everything, including what you're hearing in this episode, is from artlist.io. So I personally love it for many reasons. You can find, in a very simple way, high quality music that fits exactly what you need. I really love the cinematic quality and just the big production feel that their music has. And their subscription is only $199 for a full year of licenses, and there's no additional cost, so you can download as many songs as you want. And they also have a simple one worldwide license, which covers literally any kind of production. So you know that if you're going from YouTube to TV to any kind of distribution for your videos, for your projects, you are covered and you don't need to buy any additional licenses for that. So that's a huge plus. And now their library is constantly being updated, but it's not just updated with just a ton of tracks thrown in there. They really stay on top of the latest trends, and their music just really feels modern. So you can find the latest indie pop sounds or any other sound that's really coming up and that's popular, and you can include that in your video without any concerns of copyright. So to me, that's amazing. So there you go. Now you know where I get my music, and what I'm actually going to do is I'm also going to create a folder to some of my favorite tracks that just sound epic and cinematic and that can fit a lot of video ideas. So I'm gonna make a folder of that, and I'm gonna share a link for you guys so that if you do sign up, you have a pretty solid starting point. So guys, check out Artlist, and if you use the link that I'm providing in the description below, you actually get 2 months for free added to your subscription.
So some things based on what Alex was saying is to place the sounds into your scene, not just in terms of fitting them in the environment with reverb, but also actually physically, mentally placing them in your scene in terms of space and where they're taking place. So one of the great tips that Alex had was to apply an EQ to some of the sounds that are taking place further away from your scene. And this is just how sound behaves and how it travels. Some of the bassier side of sounds are gonna come a lot clearer compared to the higher end, so clipping those off in a simple way with EQ could be a great start. From there, of course, you can add reverb, and if things are further away, maybe the sound is scattering in a wider type of pattern, and there's a lot more reverb in that compared to something that's a little bit closer to us. So these are all things that you can experiment and play with, and honestly, once you start getting an ear for them and you start applying even these two very simple effects, but applied in different ways into your scene, you can start to really see what's clicking and what's making sense for your scene. And with that kind of idea, you can kind of do the same thing for sounds that are taking place outside of an environment. I can do just a basic low pass on some of the sounds, for example, that are taking place outside of this space so that they do sound like they're actually outside and they're just slightly muffled. So there's a lot of different ways that you can use this tool to place the sounds in your scene. And another great way of using the equalizer, which we previously mentioned a little bit, is to take out certain frequencies to open up some room for other sounds that are being overlaid with each other. So for example, sometimes you can have a lot of bassy elements that are stacked on top of each other, and all of that bass is adding up and it's creating distortion. It just feels a little bit cluttered. So by using the parametric equalizer in Premiere Pro, you can actually take out certain frequencies, open up some room, some pockets of sound, so that everything fits together in a much nicer way. Now this takes a little bit of experience and some playing around, but once you get a hang of it, you can really start to see how you can declutter your timeline and still have a full spectrum of sounds that fills up your scene. So we've talked about balancing things and mixing things together in terms of frequencies with EQ, but you also need to think about levels and how everything will fit together in terms of volume, in terms of how loud things are coming in. And you can make individual adjustments to the clips by hitting Command and clicking on the little gray line in the middle of the clips, and you can adjust the volume of it that way. You can also apply some transitions at the beginning or end of cuts in your audio clips. But if you're using the audio track mixer, you can actually control the overall level of that track. And this is really, really important when it comes to sound designing for a few different reasons. Like Alex mentioned, it's really important to stay organized in your timeline. And if you split things off in your timeline through the audio tracks and you have individual audio tracks that are dedicated to specific sounds, that will make your life a lot easier. Now, another benefit of laying things out in your timeline that way, by separating things out in individual audio tracks, is that then you can take advantage of the audio track mixer. So if you want to add effects to, for example, just a set of sounds that are outside and you want to add some reverb or you want to muffle them, now you can add that effect to that track and it will be applied to all the sound effects that are contained in that track. So this not only speeds things up for you, but it also gives you a clear visual representation of how your scene is laid out in terms of layers and sound. So this also means that you can adjust levels, as we've talked about before, and you don't have to create all those individual points on clips, making things fade in and out or get quieter or louder that way. You can actually now use a fader from the audio track mixer that you can control your levels that way. And now I want to show you a cool trick. You've seen me mention palette gear before. They're not sponsoring this episode, but I've used them quite a bit, and I'm in love with these things. I mean, I'm not gonna get sidetracked. I made a whole video about them, so if you're interested, I'll link it in the info cards and in the description. But as you can see, we have a physical fader here. And because this works with Premiere Pro, what I can do is I can assign a fader from the track mixer in Premiere and assign it to this physical fader. But wait, it gets even better. If we go in Premiere, in our track, and you can see how right now it says read in this portion over here, if we click on it, and in this drop-down window, we select latch or write, if I start playing my audio, and I start also messing with this fader, it's going to record all of the movement of that fader, which is linked to this fader, so that you can essentially play your edit and just adjust the volume in a physical way as you go along. Yeah. I think it's really cool, but if you don't have to use palette gear for this, you can always do it inside of Premiere Pro with your mouse, and you can just adjust things in that same function that way. But, I mean, come on.
Another way of fitting sounds into your scene in a physical sense is with panning. And to do this, it's very simple. In Premiere Pro, you can go under the effects controls of any selected audio clip, and then from there you can control the panning of that clip to go from the left speaker or the right speaker. And this allows you to kind of move sounds from one ear to the next. So if you have a traveling car, for example, that's going from left to right, you can animate the panning to kind of match that movement, and it just solidifies that sound and that object as being in your scene. Okay, so I want to show you the clip that I've been talking about and how Alex added the sound to match with the visuals and the emotion.
So the original version of the film that was music only obviously leaves the film quite open to interpretation, and most of the emotional responses come in only from the music. But when you start to add sound, you'll see that there's kind of a lot more options with what you can create. So for the first version of the sound design and mix, we kind of followed our original interpretation of Timeless, which was that it was kind of this nostalgic film about a man in Italy kind of rediscovering a car from his kind of former life, and kind of rediscovering all the different intricate elements of that. The way we achieved that was through very detailed Foley, so that you can kind of hear every individual movement, whereas in the version where there's only music, the movement isn't kind of contributing to the story as much, apart from visually. So when you combine that with the sound, you get kind of another dimension to the story. So yeah, really the main effect and emotion we wanted to provide with the sound here was kind of this nostalgia.
So yeah, the thing that really jumped out to me, even just as an audience, just watching this, I could really feel the connection between the character and the car a lot more. You know, you can really bring it in closer in that hyper realistic sense, like really hear and highlight certain sounds that really matter, not just for the story, but it also felt like they mattered to the person. So the gloves and the contact with the steering wheel and the creak in the seat, all these little beats and sound that really drove in that feeling and kind of brought us so close to, not just in terms of sounds, but it brought us close to that emotion of what it feels to hear all these things, even from the actor's perspective. His emotive state is very close to the car, and he would be hearing those sounds almost in an exaggerated way in his head because that's what he's really paying attention to.
So for me, the music was telling me a lot about how this guy was feeling in response to the car, but without the sound there, the feeling is only coming from the music, and it's also kind of, I don't want to say one-dimensional because the music's very effective, but it's missing one dimension that could add to it. So the sound then, like you said, brings you closer to the character and brings you closer to the vehicle, because just seeing somebody touch something isn't as powerful as hearing them touch it, because when you hear someone touching something, you feel it more than when you just see it. So like you said, the push of the buttons, the touching of the steering wheel, the putting the glove on, it's like his memories are not only visual and experience based, they're also audio based and touch based as well. It's bringing a little bit more of the emotion of touch into the film as well, just from hearing the things that he's interacting with. So in our second version of the sound design and mix, we actually took the film in a completely different direction. Whereas originally you kind of had this sweet old man in Italy, now you've got kind of this more sinister, evil character. And we kind of achieved that by changing the storyline with the sound. So when you introduce the scene, you introduce the scene with a kind of distant church bell, which you usually associate with kind of negative connotations such as funerals and things like that. You're also introduced with kind of crows in the background, and also dogs, which are kind of animals that always give a kind of a fearful response in a film scene.
That was crazy. That was just, I never thought it could actually go that far and like making me, like I felt, okay, maybe the ambience could seem creepy or whatever. No, like now that guy looks like someone I want to stay away from. I don't know, there's like something twisted about him now. And I love the part where he closes his eyes and we kind of almost enter his head just a little bit. We get a little hint of that. That's like bringing him closer, not just to the character, but to that really darker side of him. Wow, That was crazy.
What are you saying there about like where he's closing his eyes and there's like obviously there's a sound cue there. One thing, this is another tip maybe for the viewers in your film, when an actor responds to something on screen, that's a great time to implement sound design. Obviously not every time, because you don't want to be kind of overdoing it, but there always are moments in films that I find where an actor has a particular response, and it can be anything. That it might have even been a mistake on set, but then with sound you can make that not a mistake, and you can actually make that a clear direction for the story, and you can make the actor's reaction a reaction to a sound.
Even the hand and all these emotional beats that are now completely different because of the sound and the association with it.
So creating two versions of it allowed us to kind of show how these choices that I'm talking about can be implemented and can change something that visually has not changed at all. So just choosing a different choice. So a couple of things in there, like such as just choosing kind of crows instead of choosing birds, or choosing more aggressive impacts instead of kind of smooth transitions and things like that. So there's different choices that you make, for different things. And to be honest, all of that just comes from experimentation. It really does. Obviously partially it's an experience thing, but that experience is grown from experimentation, like it is with a lot of different creative fields in the film industry. You just got to try different sounds, and don't be afraid to try something that, might seem quite out there, and just place it in there and see if it gives like kind of the impression or the emotional response that you want it to give.
Aside from the technical aspect of it and getting an ear for it that you obviously have to master over time, but these are some ideas that I think can be implemented almost immediately once you open your mind up to this way of storytelling, and especially through sound.
And of course, this is a very exaggerated example. We're going from something that's emotional and a close connection with the sweet man in his car to making him look like a creepy dude that's about to murder someone. So it's obviously quite an extreme flip, but it just shows you the power of sound and sound design and how you can use that as a storytelling tool. All right, guys, so I hope you enjoyed that, and I want to thank Alex again from 344 Audio for sharing his knowledge, and hopefully you found that interesting. And again, I'll share more of that Skype conversation since there's so much more information in there in the live streams that are coming up.
Thanks for watching, guys.
And if you haven't seen the past episodes, definitely go check them out. We've talked about the best setup in terms of hardware and also how to set up Premiere so that you can edit as fast as possible. We also looked at how to make your edits just feel smoother, and just a lot of tricks that will definitely come in handy because we're going to be launching an editing contest by the end of this workshop with huge prizes, and I'm going to share more on that very soon. Follow me on Instagram. I have 2 accounts now. Kriscoart, and then my personal account under my name. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Chris Juni for Kriscoart, and I will see you next time.
I actually really like this outro song, and again, this is from Artlist. Just wanted to thank them again, and I definitely recommend you guys check them out for some high quality music for your videos.